Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. It was the first day of the fall semester when I met her. The corridors of Westford University smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, the kind of timeless scent that reminded me of my place and something larger than myself. I was a graduate. Student then, focused, determined, and stubborn about keeping my life in neat little boxes. I wasn't the kind of man who believed in distractions, especially not romantic ones. And certainly not with someone like her. Her name was Dr. Elena. Marlowe. She walked into the lecture hall in a dark blazer, her hair pinned back neatly, her stride purposeful. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that commanded respect without her saying a word. She wasn't the kind of professor who softened her edges to make students comfortable. No, she carried herself like someone who'd seen the world, and that alone drew every eye to her. But when her gaze swept the room, pausing just for the briefest second on me, it felt like the entire universe shifted an inch. One look, and I was no longer just a student. I was something else in her orbit. I told myself it was nothing. Professors looked at students all the time, but when I lingered after class to ask about a reading assignment, she leaned against the desk, her eyes not leaving mine as she answered. There was no flirtation in her words, but the warmth in her voice was personal, intimate, as though we weren't in a classroom at all. She had a way of making silence stretch between us, thick with something unspoken. Over the next few weeks, our conversations became longer. At first, it was academic debates over literature, theories about philosophy. But slowly, it turned into fragments of our lives. She told me she used to write poetry, but never had the courage to publish. I admitted I had been afraid of pursuing writing because my family thought it was impractical. These were small exchanges, but each one peeled away a layer of her that I wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't until I saw her outside of class that things began to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. I was in the city one evening when I caught sight of her sitting at a corner cafe. She wasn't alone. A man in a business suit sat across from her, his hand resting casually on hers. He was older, his smile sharp, confident. I froze, watching. Her laugh, her face softened in a way I'd never seen in class. Later, I would learn that this man was her husband. And in that moment, an ache bloomed in me that I couldn't explain. She was someone else's, and yet every fiber of my being wanted her to look at me like that. The knowledge should have made me pull away. Instead, it did the opposite. When she walked into class the next week, I noticed the faint sadness in her smile, the way her ring caught the light as she adjusted her papers. She looked tired, worn in a way no amount of makeup or confidence could hide. I began to see her differently, not just as a professor, but as a woman trapped between expectations and desire. One rainy afternoon, I stayed after class again. The last of the students filed out, their voices fading down the hall until it was just us. She gathered her notes, but her hands trembled slightly. Without thinking, I asked if she was all right. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat down at the edge of the desk, staring at the floor before whispering, "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours?" I don't know what gave me the courage, but I stepped closer. "All the time," I said. She finally looked up, and for the first time, the mask slipped. I saw the loneliness etched into her face, the longing she tried to bury. That look, raw, unguarded, was the moment everything changed. It was no longer about a professor and a student. It was about two people who recognized the same emptiness in each other. From then on, the line between us blurred. I'd find excuses to visit her office, carrying questions I already knew the answers to. She'd linger after lectures, her eyes meeting mine with a weight that made breathing difficult. And yet, neither of us crossed the line. Not yet. We lived in that dangerous in-between space, a place charged with possibility and guilt. The breaking point came during a conference trip out of town. A handful of graduate students, myself included, were invited to present papers. She was there as a keynote speaker. The hotel bar was crowded that night, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. I left early, exhausted, but as I walked down the quiet hallway toward my room, I saw her standing outside her door, fumbling with the key card. She looked up, startled, and smiled faintly. We talked there in the hallway, the dim light humming above us. About nothing and everything, how she hated these conferences, how she felt invisible in her own marriage, how I sometimes wondered if I was chasing dreams that didn't matter. Our words tumbled out in a rush, as if both of us had been waiting for this chance to be seen. Then, in a silence that stretched too long, she reached up and touched my hand. It was nothing more than a brush of fingers, but it set my whole body on fire. I should have walked away. I should have remembered she was married, that she was my professor, that this could ruin us both. But when her hand lingered, I covered. With mine, she didn't pull back. Her eyes held mine, shimmering with all the things neither of us dared to say aloud. And in that charged silence, the weight of her loneliness met the intensity of my longing. And we both knew without speaking that the line we had danced around for so long was gone. That night, everything we had been denying finally surfaced. And though guilt would follow us like a shadow, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Because one look had changed everything, and there was no going back. The air in the hotel room was heavy, thick with the silence of two people who knew exactly what they were doing and yet couldn't stop themselves. Elena stood by the window, the city lights spilling in behind her, turning her into a silhouette I couldn't look away from. Her hands were clasped in front of her as though she was trying to hold herself together, but her shoulders rose and fell with the weight of her breath. I stayed near the door, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every rational thought I had. She finally turned to me, her expression torn between fear and longing. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, but her voice trembled, betraying the certainty she wanted to project. "I know," I said quietly. Though my voice came out hoarse, neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. The hum of the city, the distant murmur of laughter from the hotel bar below, even the faint buzzing of the air conditioner, it all seemed like background noise to the storm raging inside me. I didn't plan on taking a step closer, but I did. And then another. Each one was a surrender. And by the time I was standing inches from her, the distance we had so carefully guarded for months no longer existed. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for permission to fall, to break, to finally give in. When she lifted her hand and let it rest against my chest, I knew she'd already made her choice. My own hand came up to cover hers, pressing against the wild rhythm of my heartbeat. "Elena," I whispered, her name tasting forbiddance on my tongue. She closed her eyes then, leaning forward until her forehead rested against mine. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but the intimacy of it shattered everything. We were no longer professor and student, no longer bound by titles or rules. We were simply two people standing on the edge of something that could ruin us both. The kiss came quietly, almost hesitantly, as though neither of us wanted to admit what was happening. But once it began, there was no stopping it. Months of restraint, of stolen glances and lingering touches came flooding out. I felt her desperation, her loneliness, in the way her fingers clung to me. I gave her my longing, my need, my unspoken love in return. The night unfolded in ways I will never be able to put into words without cheapening it. It wasn't about lust, not entirely. It was about two people who had been starving for connection finally finding it, even if it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. When we finally lay tangled together, the silence was different, no longer heavy, but fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. I thought the morning would bring regret, but when I opened my eyes and found her watching me, her expression soft and unguarded, I knew she felt the same impossible mixture of guilt and tenderness. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, and whispered, "We can't let this happen again." But the way her hand lingered told me otherwise. Back on campus, nothing looked different, yet everything had changed. I sat in her lectures like I always had, took notes like any other student, but every time her eyes flicked toward me, the memory of her touch came rushing back. She was careful, more careful than I could have ever been, but I could see it in The way her gaze softened when no one was looking. The way her smile faltered when our hands brushed as she handed back my papers. We tried to be distant. For weeks, we convinced ourselves that what happened in that hotel room was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, something to bury and never speak of again. But no matter how hard we tried, the pull between us only grew stronger. One evening, she asked me to meet her in her office. When I walked in, she closed the door behind me, her face pale, her hands twisting together in nervousness. "I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "And I don't know what to do anymore." I stepped closer, the air between us charged with the same dangerous tension as before. "Neither do I said softly. "But I know I don't want to stop." That was the night everything shifted from an accident to a choice. We weren't just two people who gave in once. We became two people who kept choosing each other, despite the risks, despite the guilt, despite the fact that every moment we spent together was borrowed time. Her marriage, though, was a shadow that loomed over us. I never asked her to leave him, and she never promised she would. But late at night, when she lay against me and confessed the way she felt invisible in her own home, I hated him. I hated the man who had the right to call her his, while I had to keep her as a secret. And yet, for all the torment it brought, I couldn't let her go. Neither of us could. The affair stretched on longer than I ever imagined it would. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Every stolen kiss, every hidden touch, every whispered confession in the dark deepened the bond we swore we would never allow to happen. I knew it couldn't last forever, affairs never do, but as long as she kept looking at me the way she did, as long as she kept choosing me in the quiet moments when no one else could see, I didn't care about forever. All I cared about was her. The spring semester bled into summer, and with it came the weight of a secret that grew heavier each day. Elena and I lived in two worlds, one painted in shadows and quiet rooms, the other lit brightly with the illusion of normalcy. In her lectures, she wore the mask of the untouchable professor, composed and confident. I sat among the other students, forcing my eyes down to my notes, even though my body ached to look at her. We pretended for everyone else, but the pretending made us ache more. Nights were different. Nights belonged to us. Sometimes it was her office, the blinds drawn, her books and papers pushed aside to make space for something reckless and real. Sometimes it was a hotel an hour outside the city, far enough where no one might recognize us. On rare occasions, it was her own home when her husband was away on business. Those nights were dangerous, almost unbearable in their intimacy. The scent of his cologne clung faintly to their sheets, a reminder of the man who lived in her house, but no longer lived in her heart. She would lie next to me in the dark, whispering things she couldn't say in daylight. "I don't know when I stopped loving him," she confessed once, her head resting on my chest. Maybe it wasn't all at once. Maybe it was little by little, all the times he stopped listening, stopped seeing me. I kissed the top of her hair and said nothing because words weren't enough. What could I possibly offer? I was younger, still carving out my life, while she was tethered to one she couldn't easily walk away from. But in those moments when her hand clung to mine, like it was her only lifeline, I believed I was enough doubt it couldn't last without cracks. Rumors began to circle in quiet corners of campus, though never loud enough to reach her directly. A teaching assistant once caught me leaving her office late in the evening, her eyes narrowing as though she knew more than she should. At home, her husband began asking questions, subtle at first. Why she stayed late, why she came home distracted, why her phone seemed to be in her hand more often than before. She brushed him off with practiced ease, but I could see the fear tightening around her. One night, as we lay tangled in each other in the dim glow of a motel lamp, she asked me, "How long do you think we can keep doing this?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her forever, but the truth pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't ignore. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I don't want it to end." Her eyes glistened, catching the lamplight. "Neither do I, but when it does." She trailed off, her voice breaking, and I pulled her against me, as if holding her tighter could keep the world from tearing us apart. It was during the fall, nearly a year after that first night, that everything shifted. Her husband found a message, nothing explicit, nothing incriminating, but enough to plant a seed of suspicion he couldn't ignore. Elena came to me pale and shaken, her hands trembling as she told me what had happened. "He asked me if there was someone else," she said, her voice cracking. "I told him no, but I don't know how much longer I can keep lying." The weight of what we were doing crashed down on me in that moment. I wanted her free, I wanted her mine, but the thought of being the reason her life unraveled filled me with guilt I couldn't voice. For weeks, the tension between us grew unbearable. Our meetings became fewer, shorter, tainted with a shadow of discovery. And yet, the fewer moments we had, the harder it became to let them go. When we kissed, it was frantic, desperate, as if we knew each one might be the last. When we made love, it was not just passion, it was a clinging, a refusal to release what we had built, no matter how fragile it was. Eventually, the day came when she couldn't hide anymore. Her husband confronted her directly, his voice raised, his eyes demanding truth she had buried too long. She confessed enough to shatter him, though she never spoke my name. That night, she came to me, broken and shaking, saying only, "He knows." I held her as she cried, the weight of it pressing down on both of us. For the first time, I saw the road ahead clearly. It wouldn't end cleanly. There would be damage. There would be fallout. There would be wounds that might never heal. But as she lifted her tear-streaked face and whispered, "I can't lose you," I realized I was already too far gone to turn back. The affair that began in silence and shadows had now stepped into the light, and there was no undoing it. We were bound together, not by accident, but by choice. A choice that would cost us everything. After that night, nothing was ever the same. Elena stopped pretending at home, and the silence between her and her husband grew sharper than words. She moved through her house like a stranger, her eyes distant, her smile forced, her voice breaking under the weight of what she wasn't saying. Every time we met, she clung to me harder, as though she was terrified I would slip away just when she needed me most. There were nights she would call me at 2 or 3 in the morning, her voice trembling. "He won't even look at me anymore," she whispered once. "He doesn't touch me. He doesn't ask me where I'm going. It's like I don't exist." I would listen, my chest tightening, hating the pain in her voice, but selfishly grateful too, because her husband's distance only drew her closer to me. Sometimes, after those late-night calls, she would drive across the city just to crawl into my bed. She would arrive barefoot, her hair tangled from the wind, her body trembling as though she'd run all the way to me. And when she wrapped herself around me, I felt like she belonged nowhere else. The danger only heightened everything. Every time she touched me in her office, my heart pounded with the knowledge that one knock on the door could end us. Every time we walked together in the city, her hood pulled low, her hand brushing mine but never daring to hold it in public. The air crackled with the tension of what we couldn't show the world. That secrecy made our love feel like fire, dangerous, reckless, impossible to contain. But with fire always comes the burn. Her husband wasn't blind. The distance that had grown between them only made his suspicion sharper. He stopped traveling, stopped leaving her alone at night, began watching her more closely. Elena confessed to me one evening, her face pale as the streetlight above us, that he had gone through her phone again. "He didn't find anything," she said, her voice hoarse, but I saw it in his eyes. "He knows. He just doesn't want to admit it." That was the night I asked her what I had been too afraid to ask before. "Do you want to leave him?" The silence that followed nearly broke me. She looked away, her eyes glassy, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. My family, my reputation, my career. If I leave, I lose everything, except you." She looked at me then, her eyes so full of sorrow and love that it hollowed me out. "And I don't know if you're enough to fill all that I'll lose." Her honesty cut deep, but I understood. I was still young, still building a future. She'd already built hers, and to tear it down for me wasn't a choice she could make easily. But even knowing that, even hearing those words, I couldn't walk away. She had become the pulse in my veins, the thought that carried me through every day. The months that followed were unbearable in their intensity. We drifted between stolen joy and crushing guilt, each kiss weighted with the knowledge of the damage it left behind. There were moments I wanted to shout our truth to the world, to pull her hand into mine and refuse to let her go back to a man she didn't love. But there were other moments when I saw her exhaustion, when I saw the fear in her eyes, that I wondered if loving me had only trapped her in a deeper cage. The breaking point came one bitter December evening. Snow lined the streets, and the city glowed with holiday lights, but Elena's face was shadowed with something darker. She had just come from an argument with her husband, one that ended with him demanding names, demanding to know who had stolen her away from him. She hadn't told him, but she knew she couldn't keep dodging the truth much longer. She looked at me that night as though I were both her salvation and her undoing. "I can't keep living like this," she said, her voice trembling as her breath fogged in the cold air. "I'm breaking apart, and if I keep hiding, I'll lose myself completely." I reached for her hand, my voice low, steady, even though my heart was racing. "Then don't hide anymore. Choose me. Choose us." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. It's not that simple, but it was, at least to me. I kissed her right there in the falling snow, reckless and exposed, as if daring the world to see. For the first time, I didn't care who knew. And as she melted against me, I realized she didn't care either, not in that moment. Still, the choice hung between us, heavier than ever. Her marriage was crumbling, her career teetering on the edge of scandal, and I knew soon she would have to decide whether to step fully into my arms or retreat into the life she had always known. And though every part of me ached for her to choose, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered the one thing I was too afraid to admit, that love like ours, born in secrecy and fire, rarely survived the daylight. The days after that snowy night blurred into one another, filled with tension so thick it clung to everything we did. Elena started showing up at my apartment more often, sometimes without calling, just appearing at the door with her face pale and her eyes rimmed red. I would let her in without a word, and she'd collapse into me as if she had been holding herself together all day just to fall apart in my arms. Her husband grew more restless, more suspicious. He began calling her at random times, checking on her under the guise of concern, but with questions sharp enough to wound. She told me once that he had started timing her drives, asking for receipts from grocery stores, watching the way she dressed when she went out. He wasn't violent, but his control tightened around her like a vice, and I could see how it was suffocating her. One evening, after a particularly brutal argument, she came to me and confessed that he had finally asked her point blank if she was in love with someone else. She had denied it, but the way her hands shook when she told me said more than her words ever could. "He knows," she whispered. "He just doesn't want to believe it." I couldn't stand seeing her like that, trapped, hurting, torn in two. I begged her again to leave him. I painted pictures of a life together, of mornings where she wouldn't have to sneak away, of nights where her phone wouldn't buzz with his demands. But every time she hesitated, her eyes clouding with fear of what she would lose. And yet, there were glimpses, moments that convinced me she wanted that life as much as I did. The way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, as though I were her anchor in a storm. The way she kissed me with desperation, clutching my face like she was afraid I'd vanish. She wanted freedom. She wanted me, but the chains of her past, her marriage, her career, all weighed her down. The breaking point came not with her husband, but with her family. One afternoon, she confessed that her mother had noticed the distance. In her marriage, had asked too many questions. Elena's guilt spilled over then. She sobbed into my chest, whispering about how ashamed she felt, how she was betraying not just a husband, but a life everyone believed in. "I don't want to disappoint them," she choked out. but I can't stop loving you. It was in that moment I realized love wasn't always enough. Sometimes it was heavy, suffocating, a burden you carried even when it lifted you higher than anything else ever could. I wanted to be selfish, to demand she choose me no matter the cost. But when I saw the torment in her, I knew that if I pushed too hard, I might lose her entirely. So I told her I'd wait. However long it took, whatever she needed to figure out, I would be there. My words were steady, but inside I was unraveling. Waiting felt like both devotion and torture, a vow that bound me to a future that might never come. Winter turned to spring, and the cracks in our marriage deepened. She no longer hid the distance from her husband. He saw it in her every move, her every silence. One evening, she came to me after he had stormed out of the house. She told me he had accused her of being in love with someone else again. This time, she hadn't denied it. She hadn't confessed to me by name, but she hadn't lied either. Her hands were shaking as she told me this, her voice trembling but filled with a strange new resolve. "It's falling apart," she whispered. "I can't stop it anymore." I pulled her close, my heart racing with both hope and fear. For the first time, it felt like the walls between us might actually crumble. But it also meant the danger was sharper, the risk of being discovered greater than ever. Every kiss felt like it could be our last. Every touch carried the weight of a choice she was running out of time to make, and though I didn't say it aloud, I could feel it deep in my chest. The moment of truth was coming. She would either choose me and destroy the life she had built, or she would let me go and bury what we had under silence and regret. But the way she clung to me that night, the way her tears soaked into my shirt as she whispered she loved me over and over again, I wanted to believe that love like ours, no matter how forbidden, could still find a way to survive.